The coolant line exploded with a sound like tearing fabric, showering Kalen's environmental suit in superheated, vaporized flux. He recoiled instantly, the pain registering as a sharp, localized burn on his left shoulder insulation, though the suit maintained integrity. Density shift registered, Sever reported, the AI's voice tight with electronic aggravation. Structural integrity in Sector Beta 7 now reads at 0.03%. Kalen, the hull is not separating, it is liquefying. Kalen pulled the cutting laser back, the exposed wiring beneath the heavy plating of the Old Doubt sparking with terminal inefficiency. The odor of burnt lubricant and old, static dust, the hallmark of high-grade human military failure, choked the interior atmosphere. Human failures always complicate thermodynamics, Sever. Pull us back. The inertial dampener core. The reason Kalen had spent 3 agonizing cycles cutting through this section was inaccessible. It was not merely fused to the hull, it was physically integrated, stabilized by a localized field of unknown, persistent energy. The core was untouchable, preserved with the same baffling perfection as the sealed reading room he had found and chosen to hide. The commander won, Kalen thought bitterly, wiping sweat that condensed inside his helmet. The cruiser refuses to be salvaged. This was not merely a mechanical setback. It was a financial death blow. Kalen had gambled the last of his working credit on the 300 cycles needed to acquire the cruiser, betting that the high-value military components would clear his 6-week debt to the Relith Port Authority. Time elapsed since contract initiation. 24 hours, 0 minutes, Sever informed him, stating the obvious cruelty of the deadline. We have recovered precisely 0% of the estimated 20,000 cycles required to clear your debt obligation. Kalen looked at the glowing red barrier protecting the dampener core. It shimmered, humming a low frequency that made the fillings in his teeth ache. This was not benign preservation. It was aggressive defense of obsolete technology. They didn't just abandon their ships, Kalen muttered, kicking a heavy piece of insulation. It clattered down the corroded corridor. They booby-trapped them with philosophy. He cycled the airlock open. The wind shear of Relith Port hit him, a chaotic gale carrying the sharp tang of ionized copper and the deep fatigue industrial. He climbed down the scaffolding, the platform shaking beneath his weight. Waiting for him on the rusted perimeter, bathed in the sickly yellow-orange light of the docking bay, was Valrek. Valrek was a Catharian, a species that had evolved patience and predatory efficiency in equal measure. His scales were the color of tarnished brass, and his eyes, multifaceted black lenses, showed no reflection, only calculation. He was flanked by 2 Authority enforcers, their heavy pulse rifles hanging ready. "Kalen?" Valrek hissed, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like sandpaper on steel. "You missed the deadline by 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Kalen removed his helmet, the cold air hitting his face. He felt the tension constrict his throat, making speech difficult. "Valrek, the dampeners are fused. I require 48 more hours to bypass the core locks. This is military hardware, not scrap plating." Valrek tilted his head, a gesture of mild professional amusement. "You purchased a scrap husk, Kalen. That was your assessment. The Authority accepts scrap value only. Your purchase price was 300 cycles. Your accrued debt is 21,500 cycles. The interest is astronomical," Kalen argued, fighting to keep his voice level. "It is market standard for salvaged human relic liabilities," Valrek countered smoothly. "And now, since you have failed to render payment, the debt is accelerated. The ship is forfeit. You are forfeit." Kalen felt the cold dread sink into his bones. Being forfeit on Relith Port meant slow disassembly for parts, or worse, forced conscription into the deep space extraction contracts, which were 99% fatal. "I have assets, Valrek. I have contacts. I can move 3,000 tons of polymer steel alloy in 60 hours if you grant me access to the deep cut machinery." Valrek smiled, a slow, unpleasant parting of his jaws that revealed 3 rows of serrated teeth. "The Authority already owns the hull. Kalen, we own the dirt you stand on, and soon we will own the suit you wear." However, the Catharian paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle, savoring the taste of Kalen's sudden, visceral fear. This was the injustice, the efficient, systemic crushing of a minor failure, using debt as the primary weapon. The Authority has an opportunity for you, a contract, 1 mission. If you complete it, the debt is cleared. If you fail, the assets are recovered from your biological envelope. Kalen did not ask the rate of recovery. He already knew. It would be cold, clinical, and complete. "What is the mission?" Kalen asked, tasting the Decadentia Biologica. The faint, moldy smell of the port's recycled air mixed with the adrenaline surging through his system. Valric's enforcers moved slightly, tightening their perimeter. The air vibrated with the low, menacing hum of their pulse weapons. The Authority requires the retrieval of a specific piece of human technology, Valric stated, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. It is designated the Hollis Wind Contingency. It is an archival drive, located deep within the ruins of the Proxima campaign perimeter. Kalen stiffened. The Proxima campaign. That meant the Sector 13 dead zone, where the heavy gravity wells made warp jump suicidal and the orbital debris field was still active with automated 50-year-old human defense platforms. That area is off limits. Autonomous weapon systems fire on anything with a thermal signature greater than 0.7 Kelvin. It's a tomb world, Kalen said, the words catching in his throat. Precisely. That is why the mission is worth 25,000 cycles, and the nullification of your debt. The data we seek is non-military, non-commercial. It is political in nature. It concerns the command structure's decision regarding the final evacuation vector. The decision to run, Kalen thought, the final disastrous retreat. Why an archival drive? Why not simply hack the military nets? The drive is believed to contain the unedited, raw log of the final command council meeting. We need the original context, Kalen. We want to understand the moment when humanity, faced with true existential threat, decided to cannibalize itself to survive. This is information the current human diaspora refuses to release. Valric held out a small metallic data chit. The coordinates are locked to this device. You will use the Old Doubt as your transport. The cruiser, for all its rusted vanity, is shielded by its very obsolescence. Its spectral signature will be recognized as harmless debris by the ancient defense network. Kalen looked down at the chip. Using the very symbol of human failure, the ship that held the core of their regret, to retrieve the official record of their final, desperate political failure. It was perfectly, cruelly ironic. You have 72 hours, Kalen. Failure means the Authority initiates immediate claim on all your current and future assets, including your identity sequence. Kalen took the chip, feeling the faint charge of Horus Paranoia Electrica sword running through the metal. It was cold, small, and utterly damning. He looked back at the rusted hulk of the Old Doubt, now his only lifeline. Inside that ship, behind a meter of polymer steel, was a library dedicated to saving silence and contemplation. Outside, he was being forced into a suicide run to expose the loudest, most frantic moment of human history. Understood, Kalen said, the word a rasp of resignation. I will prepare. The Old Doubt for jump. Valric gave a curt nod, turning away with his enforcers. As they moved, the ambient lighting caught the multifaceted surface of the Therian's eye, and Kalen saw the deep, chilling lack of emotion. He was just a ledger, balanced by the expenditure of a disposable life. Kalen returned to the airlock, the heavy metallic smell of the port settling deep in his lungs. He needed to calculate the fuel, he needed to calibrate the jump drive, and most pressingly, he needed to bypass the Old Doubt's impossible preservation field, not for profit, but for survival. If the ship was going into the Proxima dead zone, it needed every ounce of power, even if it meant destroying the Commander Cyrus's silent monument. He reached the airlock manual override. Sever reappeared beside his shoulder, the cubic drone analyzing the data chip. The coordinates are precise. Kalen, the depth of the debris field is extreme. Survival probability, accounting for ship decay and the hostile environment, is estimated at 0.002%. This is not a contract. It is an execution order disguised as a debt restructuring initiative. I know, Sever, Kalen whispered, his hand resting on the corroded metal door. Furthermore, Sever continued, the synthesized voice now unusually clipped, the data chip contains a secondary file. It is encrypted, military grade, and locked to the presence of a specific neural signature, that of Commander Cyrus, the man who sailed this ship to oblivion. Kalen stopped. He stared at the rusted airlock. He is the key to accessing the Hollis Wind Contingency, Sever concluded. Valric knows Cyrus is dead, unless Cyrus did not complete his mission of isolation. He left behind something else. Kalen looked back at the sealed wall containing the silent room. He had assumed the commander had died peacefully, alone, guarding his books. Now Kalen knew he had to open that vault again. He needed to know what part of Commander Cyrus might still be listening, and what terrible tool he had left for the next man to discover. The silence of the tomb world was about to be broken. The silence of the tomb world was about to be broken. Kalen felt the metallic itch of the data chip pressed into the palm of his environmental glove, the cold weight of the Hollis Wind Contingency replacing the familiar dread of poverty with the sharper, more immediate terror of a death sentence. 0.002% survival probability. That was the calculus of the Authority. He climbed back up the scaffold, the rusted ladder rungs slick with condensation from the temperature differential. The old doubt was inert, a corpse demanding resuscitation. Every step Kalen took resonated with the fatigue of a man forced to choose between inevitable ruin and immediate, spectacular self-destruction. He re-entered the ruined command deck. The atmospheric regulators were struggling, the air thick with the smell of ozone, dead dust, and the subtle, lingering scent of old human desperation. "Sever!" Kalen commanded, voice strained. "Reroute all residual power from the secondary environmental buffers to the main cutting laser. We are going back to the vault." "Kalen, the vault's primary function is structural preservation of the literary artifacts," Sever protested. "Bypassing the shell will irreversibly damage the internal atmosphere and compromise the integrity of the contents." "I don't care about the integrity of the contents, Sever. Commander Cyrus locked the key to Valrek's mission inside his mausoleum. If the Authority wants to understand human failure, they will have to accept the destruction of human contemplation. Give me access codes to the internal locking mechanisms." Kalen moved to the scarred stern wall, tracing the almost invisible seam of the polymer steel vault door. The metal was still unnaturally cold to the touch, rejecting the ambient heat of the cruiser. He calibrated the cutting laser, setting the frequency to oscillate at the resonant frequency of the alloy, hoping to shatter the internal lock instead of vaporizing the surrounding structure. As he worked, focusing on the microscopic adjustments, Kalen felt the residual energy surge through the hull. He was deliberately killing the one piece of engineering on the cruiser that was not fundamentally broken. Worthless truth. He remembered telling Sever he had defended its worthlessness against the greed of the scrap dealers. Now he was the one devaluing it, trading philosophy for 3 days of life. The lock groaned. Not the smooth, engineered retraction from before, but a tortured shriek of protesting metal. A heavy, humid breath of air rushed out as the thick vault door ground inward, spitting sparks of fused security filament. The preserved library was instantly assaulted by the dead atmosphere of the command deck. The soft, warm internal glow flickered once, then died, replaced by Kalen's harsh work lamp. The silence was gone. The immediate contrast was jarring. The smell of dry paper and old earth rain instantly mixed with the scent of burnt lubricant and the metallic tang of Relith port. Kalen stepped inside, boots crunching on the pristine wooden floor. Atmospheric stability dropping rapidly, Sever reported clinically. Internal humidity at 7% and falling. The books are beginning to crack. Estimated time until total entropy, 30 minutes. Kalen ignored the digital autopsy of the room. He moved straight to the desk, seizing the Commander Cyrus's personal journal. The paper felt fragile, dry, and cold, already reacting to the vacuum-baked air. He flipped through the final, circled entry. "If you can read this, the grand deception has worked. They only look for weapons and gold. They never look for silence." Kalen cursed under his breath. Cyrus hadn't merely left context. He had left a puzzle. The terrible tool Sever spoke of had to be the key to the neural encryption. "Focus on the secondary file on the Authority chit, Sever. What parameters define the required neural signature?" "The encryption matrix requires a 3-point signature. Emotional resonance, cognitive loop stability, and a specific sequence of suppressed traumatic memory," Sever analyzed. "The matrix is designed to activate only when accessed by a personality that exhibits Cyrus's unique pattern of self-recrimination and strategic denial." Kalen ran his hand over the ornate clock-like chronometer. It was still running, but the numbers were flickering wildly now. 57:42. 57:41. Cyrus didn't just die here. He archived himself. Kalen realized the cold dread returning. He digitized his trauma and used it as a lock. He looked at the small room, the leather chair, the physical books. Cyrus hadn't saved the past. He had saved the regret of the past, hoping to use it as a future weapon. Kalen snatched up the optical drive and slammed it into the cruiser's main diagnostic slot. "Connect the optical drive to the Authority data chit. Sever, we need to generate Cyrus's neural signature artificially." "Impossible. Simulating complex human trauma requires a vast data infrastructure and specific, real-time feedback loops. Our onboard processor is capable only of simple environmental regulation and tactical calculations." Kalen felt the pressure building, not just the 72-hour clock ticking, but the invisible hands of the Authority closing in. Valrek wouldn't wait long. He had to think like Cyrus, the man who valued silence so much he built a 30,000-ton monument to quiet reflection. What was Cyrus's life before the war? What did he leave behind? Kalen pressed. Sever accessed the heavily fragmented personnel files, the data barely readable through the corruption. Cyrus was a fleet commander, assigned to the Proxima Evacuation Fleet. Prior to command, he was a specialist in historical preservation. He had one recorded family contact, A daughter, Kyril Hale. Kaelin stared at the name. Kyril Hale. Kyril Hale was left behind, Kaelin. She was 17 standard years old at the time of the final evacuation. Commander Cyrus signed the order condemning Sector 13, knowing she was still inside the perimeter. Kaelin felt a visceral twist of recognition, a brief, sharp memory of a different kind of abandonment. He remembered the sting of salt and the empty look in his own father's eyes when the debt collectors took everything but the clothes on their backs. Systemic failure wasn't a bomb, it was a withdrawal of security. The traumatic memory, Kaelin whispered, his throat dry. He needs to feel the decision to sacrifice his own child to open the file. Correct. The key is profound, strategic failure tied to personal loss. Kaelin grabbed one of the physical books from the shelf. It was a dense philosophical history of human migration. Futile now, meaningless paper. He ran his thumb over the spine, thinking of the cost. He was no Commander Cyrus, but he knew failure. He knew abandonment. We can't simulate it, Kaelin decided, his gaze fixed on the Hollis Wynn data chip. But we can find someone who is still carrying that trauma. Someone who embodies the failure Cyrus sealed away. You mean Kyril Hale? Sever asked. She would be 72 standard years old now if she survived the dead zone. If she survived, she is the only person whose neural signature naturally aligns with the emotional consequences of Cyrus's choice, Kaelin confirmed. Valrek knows this. That's why the mission is a suicide run. They didn't just want the drive, but they wanted us to fail trying to retrieve it, justifying the debt acceleration. Kaelin ripped the optical drive from the diagnostic slot, the motion sharp and final. He looked at the chronometer. 57:30Y. The air in the room was palpably drier, the wooden desk starting to show spiderweb cracks. He had 72 hours to cross 2 sectors of contested space, penetrate the most heavily defended debris field in known history, locate a missing woman who was almost certainly dead, and bring her back alive to Relith Port, all before the Authority claimed his identity sequence. Kaelin moved to the ship's primary control chair. He didn't bother to close the vault door. The preservation effort was already ruined. New vector, Sever. We are not heading for Proxima Sector 13 immediately. We are hunting Kyril Hale. Search all peripheral colony rosters for a 72-year-old human female matching the genetic markers of Commander Cyrus, known living on or near any gravity well transition zone. Searching. This detour will cost us an estimated 40 hours of travel time, reducing our window for the dead zone insertion to 32 hours, Sever cautioned. I know the math. A 0.002% survival rate is still zero if we don't have the key, Kaelin stated, strapping himself into the cockpit. He felt the cold realization sink in. The mission wasn't to retrieve data, it was to utilize human suffering. Valrek, the systemic administrator of debt, was forcing him to exploit the generational trauma of an entire species. Kaelin ignited the main engine regulators. The old Doubt, designed for silent reflection, roared to life with a grinding cough of neglected machinery. The ship shuddered violently, protesting the sudden demand for thrust. Kyril Hale found, Sever announced, the sound of the engine vibrating through Kaelin's bones. She is registered on Kepler 18, Sector Gamma 4. She works in deep well excavation. Coordinates locked. Kaelin gripped the controls. The heavy, rusted hulk slowly began to lift from the docking cradle, casting a long skeletal shadow across the industrialized filth of Relith Port. He watched the port lights shrink in the rearview display, the last vestiges of safe harbor vanishing into the void. Contact Valrek, Kaelin ordered, his voice flat. Tell him I am initiating the mission and that I require an additional 600 cycles of working credit for necessary consumables. Non-negotiable? You are demanding more resources from the Authority? Sever sounded appalled. I'm establishing a functional boundary, Sever. Valrek thinks he purchased my death. He only purchased the means to retrieve the data. Tell him the retrieval of the Hollis Wynn contingency requires the retrieval of Kyril Hale, and that comes at a premium. Tell him if he refuses, I drop the drive into the nearest stellar nursery. He wants the context of the final failure. He will pay for the suffering he forces us to exploit. The stars blurred as the old Doubt engaged its sublight thrusters, peeling away from the docking zone. Kaelin felt a brief, desperate surge of defiance. He had 65 hours remaining. He was flying a monument to philosophical vanity to find a forgotten daughter, all to pay a 21,000 cycle debt. The absurdity of the situation, the galactic scale of the transaction of human pain, was breathtaking. Sever's synthesized voice returned, conveying Valrek's clipped reply. Valrek confirms the requested credit transfer. He wishes you to be aware, Kaelin, that the interest rate on the 600 cycles is 700%, retroactive to the moment of agreement. Kaelin didn't flinch. He had just traded a potential fortune in scrap metal for a suicide mission, paid for by a debt that would only multiply. He had secured the means to live for 3 days, but the system had ensured that even if he succeeded, he would still be owned. He stared into the warp tunnel forming ahead, the colors stretching into impossible angles. He wasn't running from the Authority. He was running toward a 72-year-old woman, the last living embodiment of Commander Cyrus's regret. Kalen was betting his life on the depth of her trauma. The warp transition was not clean. It tore through the old doubt with the force of a sudden, brutal tectonic shift. Kalen felt the controls buck violently under his gloved hands, the ship's ancient superstructure groaning in protest against the high-velocity displacement. "Warning. Hull strain approaching 50% tolerance," Seaver reported, his voice a tight stream of data alerts. "The non-standard energy output required to bypass Relith Port's orbital regulatory field is manifesting as uncontrolled thermal bleed in the primary conduit lines." The command deck was now thick with the smell of vaporized circuit grease and ozone. The temperature surged, baking the already dry air until it felt like inhaling particulate fire. Kalen ripped off his helmet, sweat instantly stinging his eyes. "The dampener core, Sever. We need to stabilize the gravimetric field response before we attempt Kepler-18's well drop. Initiate bypass sequence 6, Delta 9 on the central coil nexus." Kalen was attempting the technical fix, a high-risk maneuver that required linking the 600 cycles of borrowed Authority credit and its embedded digital payload directly into the inertial dampener's power regulators. He had bought a specialized military-grade decryption bypass module with the funds, a small, sleek device designed to break the kind of proprietary lock Cyrus had installed. He plugged the bypass module into the exposed port on the central console. The module lit up green, then flickered violently to a chaotic orange. "Bypass engaged," Sever confirmed. "Initiating decryption algorithm. Expected time, 2 minutes." Kalen leaned forward, watching the projected diagnostic schematic. The core's defense matrix was dissolving slowly like ice under a high-intensity beam. He could almost taste the moment of success, the stabilization that would make the drop into Kepler-18 survivable. Then, the color on the schematic flashed deep violet, the signal of complete system rejection. "Failure?" Sever stated, devoid of inflection. "The core is rejecting the algorithm. It is not an encryption lock, Kalen. It is a fundamental structural incompatibility. Commander Cyrus engineered the core to detect and reject any non-local processing input. The 6 Delta 9 is being processed as a threat to the dampener's philosophical integrity." Kalen slammed his fist against the console, the impact jarring his injured shoulder. Cyrus hadn't just shielded the core, he had coded it to actively repel external help, preserving its useless, perfect stasis. Before Kalen could issue a counterorder, a cascade of localized electrical discharges erupted from the console junction box nearest him. A blinding white flash filled the deck, followed by a sharp, agonizing crackle. Kalen cried out, recoiling as the discharge vaporized the sleeve of his heavy worksuit, searing the flesh of his forearm instantly. The smell of burnt synthetic material and cooked human tissue overwhelmed the deck. "Local power grid integrity. 0, Sever calculated calmly, ignoring Kalen's sharp, ragged breaths. "We have lost 40% of short-range sensor capability. Your physical trauma is secondary, Kalen. The dampener core remains locked. Gravity fluctuations will now pose a 5-fold greater threat during insertion." Kalen pressed the raw burn against the cool metal of the control yoke, fighting the urge to vomit. The system hadn't just defeated his technical solution, it had punished the attempt. "Kepler-18 approach vector established," Sever continued, the voice still clinical. "Estimated time to gravity well insertion. 15 minutes. Recommend immediate power redirection to life support. Cabin atmosphere degrading rapidly due to thermal runoff." The temperature in the cockpit was now debilitating, forcing sweat through Kalen's pores and sheets. He tasted blood and the metallic tang of fear. The environment was turning actively hostile, a systemic attempt to cook him out of the ship. "We don't divert power from the thrusters," Kalen gasped, his voice tight with pain. He grabbed a pressure bandage from the medkit and clumsily wrapped his forearm, ignoring the trembling of his fingers. "We need every joule for maneuverability in the well. Focus on the Authority data chip, Sever. Has Valric responded to the 600 cycle demand?" "Credit transfer complete. 600 cycles received. However, the transmission contained an unauthorized parasitic program designated Hound Dog 1. It is embedded deep within the navigation array's firmware." Kalen felt the cold realization settle like a block of lead in his gut. Valric hadn't been surprised by his demand. He had anticipated Kalen needing the resources, and he had used the transaction to plant a beacon. "Analyze the function of Hound Dog 1. It is a sophisticated, low-power telemetry beacon. It broadcasts our precise location and velocity every 7.5 seconds, locked to a proprietary Authority interdiction vector. They are not waiting for us to fail. They are tracking us to our destination. The siege had tightened. Kalen was now navigating a structurally compromised, overheated ship into a gravity well, serving as an unwilling guide for the authorities' inevitable cleanup crew. Can we overwrite it? Negative. Hound Dog 1 is protected by 3 layers of Catharian-grade quantum entanglement. Any attempt to modify the firmware will result in the immediate and catastrophic failure of the entire navigation system. We will lose all star charting and critical telemetry data, forcing a blind jump return or a manual insertion into the well. Kalen looked at the glowing schematic of Kepler-18, the planet filling the view screen, a swirling mix of volcanic gas and orbital industrial runoff. The gravity well was known for sudden, unpredictable spikes in local density, tearing apart ships that weren't perfectly calibrated. He was faced with the ultimate choice, a dilemma orchestrated by Valrek. Option Alpha: maintain the navigation array, enter the gravity well with precise data, ensuring a higher probability of ship survival, but knowing that Valrek is tracking their approach and will intercept Kirill Hale the moment Kalen finds her. Result: data retrieval, but guaranteed capture and det nullification through execution. Option Beta: destroy the navigation array, gain stealth and secrecy, buying the critical few hours needed to find and extract Kirill Hale, but risk a structural failure in the gravity well that would atomize the old doubt. Result: high probability of immediate death, but 0 chance of authority interdiction. He looked at the bandage on his arm, the throbbing pain a sharp reminder of the cost of technical attempts against a determined system. He thought of Commander Cyrus, sealing himself off from the world to save a quiet room. He thought of Kirill Hale, sacrificed at 17 years old for the cold calculus of evacuation logistics. Valrek wanted the data, the context of human failure, and he wanted Kalen dead. If Kalen delivered the data, he was still dead, but at Valrek's leisure. Sever, reroute the main capacitor bank charge to the navigation console's internal grounding circuit. Kalen, this is Option Beta. The energy surge required to vaporize the Hound Dog 1 encryption will render the navigation array inert. We will be flying blind through the Kepler well, Sever warned, the AI's voice tight. I understand the risks. Valrek must not receive telemetry data. Initiate the discharge sequence. I would rather be dust than their guide. Kalen braced himself against the yoke, the internal electrical heat of the ship rising around him. He felt the intense low-frequency hum as the main capacitors charged. The air grew heavy, thick with Statica Electrica, a pressure that made his hair stand on end. Discharge sequence initiated in 5 seconds. Brace for primary system shock. 5. Kalen tightened his grip, sweat mixing with the blood seeping faintly through the gauze on his arm. 4. He focused on the flickering red icon of Hound Dog 1 on the secondary monitor, the tiny leash tethering his life to Valrek's spreadsheet. 3. The ship was trembling, overloaded with redirected power. 2. He could hear the crackle growing, the sound of immense contained energy about to be unleashed. 1. A brutal physical shockwave hit the command deck, a sound like a wet explosion. The lights flickered, plunged into darkness for a sickening half-second, then returned to a dull, sputtering amber. The Hound Dog 1 icon was gone, replaced by a smoking, melted cavity in the console panel. The residual static charge made the metal surface near Kalen's hand buzz violently. Navigation array offline. Hound Dog 1 neutralized. Structural integrity further compromised by internal energy discharge. Sever reported, the data stream now fragmented. We have achieved stealth, Kalen, at the cost of 70% of our targeting capability, entering Kepler-18 gravity well in 3 minutes. Kalen wiped his face with the back of his hand, tasting the metallic, dry air. He was committed now, manual insertion. He pushed the throttle forward, adjusting the vertical stabilizers based only on his historical knowledge of Kepler's known flux points. The old doubt plunged nose first into the planet's turbulent atmosphere, the rusted hull screaming under the frictional heat. It was a nightmare descent, the ship pitching and rolling violently as they crossed unseen density layers. Kalen wrestled the yoke, fighting against the crushing asymmetrical force that threatened to twist the ancient cruiser into a corkscrew of scrap metal. For 12 minutes, it was only sound and vibration, the groaning metal, the frantic alarms, the sharp pain in his arm. Then, silence. They punched through the cloud layer. Below them stretched a massive, industrialized landscape, scarred by heavy-duty mining operations. The atmosphere was a perpetual twilight, choked by fine red excavation dust. Kalen managed a controlled skid landing, using the minimal thrust reserves to cushion the final impact. The cruiser shuddered, settling heavily into the dirt. Dust billowed up, thick and immediate, obscuring the view. Integrity violation. Minor hull breach in Sector Gamma 1, Seaver stated. We are down. 48 hours remaining to complete the mission. Kalen slumped in the pilot's chair, fatigue washing over him in waves. He was alive. He had bought secrecy with pain and debt. Coordinates, Sever. Where is Kirill Hale? Sever projected a simplified topographic map onto the scarred console. A large red zone marked Deep Well Excavation Site 7 Alpha dominated the immediate area. Kirill Hale's beacon was centrally located, deep within the industrial complex. She is within the facility, Kalen. However, the site is not designated as a civil colony or refugee camp. It is an active, restricted labor facility. Note the perimeter. Kalen peered closer at the projection, squinting through the dust settling on the screen. The complex was surrounded by a double layer of high-tension fencing and illuminated by massive, powerful floodlights that cut through the reddish gloom. Then he saw the movement. Not the passive drones of an automated site, but organized, armed sentries patrolling the fence line. Their armor was heavy, dark, and angular, a design Kalen did not recognize from the Authority or any major corporate syndicate. They carried long-barrel kinetic rifles, instruments of close-quarters enforcement. Identify the faction, Sever. That is not Valrek's security detail. Analyzing visual input, the armor iconography does not match standard galactic registry. It appears to be a localized, heavily armored paramilitary enforcement unit. Designation, the Syndicate of the Final Word. They specialize in deep well-resource extraction and maintaining forced labor discipline. Kalen felt a new, colder kind of dread. He hadn't landed in a desolate ruin or a free colony. He had crashed his debt-ridden ship into a fortified prison. A sudden, sharp beam of light lanced through the settling dust, hitting the Old Doubt's forward observation slit. The beam was instantly followed by the high-pitched, insistent whine of a weapons lock. Kalen, Sever warned, the voice barely above a whisper. We have been targeted by perimeter security. They are not waiting for identification. They are preparing a kinetic strike, threat assessment high. Kalen pulled himself upright, his burned arm screaming in protest. The Syndicate knew he was there. They were not Valrek, dealing in debt and bureaucracy. They dealt an immediate, violent response. Analysis of Kirill Hale's status, Sever, immediately. Kirill Hale is registered as a critical, high-value asset within the facility. She is not a refugee. She is a prisoner, and she is located directly beneath the primary weapons silo of the Syndicate's command tower. Kalen looked out at the lights, now closing on the derelict cruiser. He had escaped Valrek's interdiction, only to crash into a new, more immediate kind of human savagery. The final failure of Commander Cyrus had trapped his daughter in a cage guarded by soldiers who didn't care about philosophy, only profit. The door of the ship was about to be breached. The sound of the kinetic rifle locking onto the Old Doubt's hull was a high-pitched, insistent thrum that vibrated through Kalen's boots and into his teeth. He ignored the pain in his arm, the scent of antiseptic from the medkit mixing poorly with the red, sulfurous air filtering through the hull breaches. He was no longer reacting to Valrek's spreadsheet. He was reacting to immediate kinetic threat. Targeting solution, 0.3 seconds to kinetic impact, Sever hissed. They are using a 50mm slug. It will penetrate the hull and fragment on the main console. Recommend immediate evasive maneuver. Kalen didn't move toward the controls. Evasive maneuvers were useless. He had crashed into a fortified bunker, and the Old Doubt was a 300-cycle stationary target. They didn't fire, Sever. They are waiting for a hail response. They want to see what we are. The blinding light from the kinetic rifle's targeting system swept across the cockpit, then settled fixed and menacing on the airlock. Transmitting low-band civilian distress signal, Kalen. Claiming mechanical failure and salvage rights request. A moment of nerve-shredding quiet followed, filled only by the hiss of the cooling systems struggling against the environmental heat. Then, a voice, synthesized and flat, boomed across the internal comms array, bypassing the scrambled frequencies. Unidentified vessel. Your distress signal is logged. This sector is under proprietary claim by the Syndicate of the Final Word. You have violated a level 5 perimeter. Identify your cargo and purpose. Fail to comply, and salvaging will begin on your biological assets. The language was professional, ruthless, and entirely human. The Syndicate of the Final Word. Human exploitation, refined and monetized on a galactic scale. Respond to the distress signal, Sever. Civilian salvage, single operator. Claim mechanical failure after a gravity shift. Blame the gravity well? They can't argue with that. Sever compiled the official lie, transmitting a static-laden message of fake panic and technical jargon. The Syndicate voice returned, colder this time. Acknowledge, Salvager. Your story is noted. However, your vessel is a decommissioned fleet designation. The Old Doubt. That vessel carries no civilian designation. Your entry into our territorial space suggests a direct interdiction attempt. Prepare to be boarded. Do not resist. The lie failed. The ship's unique military profile, the very thing that had granted them stealth from Valric's tracking, now made them a priority target for local authority. Kalen rose, grabbing a worn-out plasma cutter and a military-grade sidearm from the emergency locker. Antiquated human weapons, but functional. They know the designation. They know Cyrus's ship, Kalen muttered. Why? The value of the vessel is 0, Kalen, but the cargo, Kirill Hale, is registered as extremely high value, Sever stated. The Syndicate is not interested in your debt or Valric's politics. They are protecting their profits. Kalen looked at the topographical map. The main weapons silo, guarding the descent shaft to Kirill Hale's location, was approximately 300 meters from their current crash site. We are not waiting for the breach. We are initiating immediate extraction. We will use the hull breach in Sector Gamma 1 as an egress point, Kalen ordered, moving toward the rear corridor. Activate the ship's internal security system, Sever. Maximum non-lethal deterrence. Flood the corridors with ionized sleep gas. By us 60 seconds. Ionized sleep gas reserves 70%. Compliance, Sever replied. Kalen reached the hull breach. It was a jagged tear, venting the ship's remaining pressurized air into the dusty twilight. He squeezed through the gap, landing hard on the deep red soil of Kepler-18. The air was dry and cold, carrying the faint, acrid smell of high-grade copper dust and decadencia industrial. The scent of heavy machinery pushed past its structural limit. He began running toward the facility, the massive, imposing structure rising like a dark fortress against the eternal red sky. 2 armed sentries, heavily armored and moving with practiced, silent efficiency, were already advancing on the old Doubt's hull breach. Kalen avoided their line of sight, using the low, scrubby mineral growth for cover. He reached the perimeter fence and activated the plasma cutter, quickly slicing through the high-tension alloy strands. He slipped inside the cordon, the Syndicate facility now looming directly ahead. The main tower was monolithic, crowned by the heavy-barreled silo of the kinetic defense battery. Kirill Hale was directly beneath that weapon. Kalen moved into the main complex, navigating a labyrinth of processing pipes and massive, dormant drill heads. He felt an intense, localized cold. He realized he was near the main cryo-storage facility. The air here was sterile, dry, and bitterly cold, the temperature actively fighting the external heat. He found a maintenance hatch, sealed shut. Sever, open this hatch. Standard maintenance code 5079er. Attempting. Success. Kalen, I am detecting a subtle, non-standard energy signature emanating from inside this shaft. It is fluctuating between a standard human neural pulse and an artificial, stable data loop. Kalen pulled the heavy hatch open. Inside, a tight vertical service shaft descended into darkness. The air was freezing and the localized energy signature pulsed with a regular, hypnotic rhythm. Kalen clipped the plasma cutter to his belt and began the descent, dropping quickly, hand over hand, down the chilled metal rungs. He descended for 20 meters before the shaft opened into a wider, sub-level corridor. This area was pristine, sterile white, a shocking contrast to the rusted hellscape above and the dusty industrial exterior. The temperature was 0 degrees Celsius, preserving the environment perfectly. At the end of the corridor was a heavy, blast-rated door, marked by no designation, save for a single small biometric reader. This is not part of the standard excavation facility, Kalen, Sever observed. The structural integrity is 30-fold greater than the surrounding complex. It appears to be a vault, designed for long-term isolation. Kalen approached the door. The air here smelled faintly of ozone and pure isolamento, the scent of a vacuum sealed off from all entropy. Kirill Hale is behind this door, Sever. Use the Cyrus genetic signature stored on the optical drive as a key, attempting biometric spoofing. A tight laser beam scanned the data chip held in Kalen's hand. The biometric reader flashed green instantly. The lock mechanisms hissed, a sound of heavy, expensive machinery yielding. The door slid open, revealing a chamber entirely unlike the industrial complex. Kalen stepped inside. The room was a small, pressurized cell, perfectly maintained, brightly lit by soft internal panels. The air was clean, recycled, and unnaturally cold. A single occupant sat on a low, metallic cot. Kirill Hale. She was 72 standard years old, but the isolation and preservation of the environment had aged her lightly. Her hair was white, neatly clipped, and her face was lined with experience, not decay. Her eyes, startlingly sharp and blue, fixed on Kalen. She wore a simple gray jumpsuit, clean and perfectly tailored. Kalen lowered his weapons, utterly disarmed by the scene. He had expected a battered prisoner, a victim of deep well slavery. He had found an occupant of a pristine, sterile cage. You are late, Kirill Hale said, her voice clear and without emotion. I have been expecting a messenger, but I assumed they would send someone competent. I am Kalen. I was sent by the Authority to retrieve the Hollis Wind Contingency data drive, Kalen stated, still processing the sterile composure of the room. We have to move now. The Syndicate is closing on the ship. Kirill Hale tilted her head, a familiar gesture that reminded Kalen briefly of the command log fragments he had read from her father. The Hollis Wind Contingency is not a data drive, Kalen. It is a protocol, and it has been operating for 55 years. It's the reason I'm here. She stood, moving with a practiced, economical grace. My father, Commander Cyrus, did not abandon me. He assigned me a final duty. This facility is not a labor camp. It is a long-term quarantine and monitoring station. The Syndicate believes I'm a high-value asset because I am the only one who can deactivate the protocol. Kalen felt the narrative structure of his mission, debt, rescue, retrieval, crumble around him. He stared at the woman, suddenly understanding the profound, chilling vanity of Commander Cyrus. What is the protocol, Kirill? She walked to a small console recessed into the wall, activating a holographic display. It showed a highly complex, layered schematic of Kepler-18, not the industrial overlay, but a geological tectonic map. And when humanity lost the Proxima campaign, Cyrus and the Command Council made a final decision. They knew the vast majority of the fleet would never reach safety. They couldn't save the system, but they chose to neutralize the greatest threat to their retreat. Kirill pointed to a central geological layer on the schematic. The enemy followed us. They were preparing to use Kepler-18 as a forward base of operations against the remaining human diaspora. It offered perfect resource density and a manageable gravity well. Hollis Wynn, the lead xenolinguist, identified their strategic weakness, their reliance on the specific low-frequency gravimetric stability of large, resource-dense planets. The contingency? Kalen pressed, urgency returning as he heard the faint sound of heavy, armored footsteps approaching the service shaft above. The contingency is a planet buster, Kalen. Cyrus didn't leave behind a quiet monument to regret. He left behind a ticking clock. The Old Doubt, his ship, your ship, was carrying the final component, not the library, the core itself. Kalen remembered the untouched, fused inertial dampener core, the one that had violently rejected his attempts to fix it. The core is not a dampener, Kalen whispered, the isolation of the room suddenly feeling like a grave. It's a resonance generator. Precisely. My father, in his final act of command, designed the Old Doubt to be worthless scrap, protecting a secret so profound it would ensure the entire planet's destruction. My job, for 55 years, was to monitor the seismic stability of Kepler-18 and await the arrival of the activation signal, the Hollis Wind Contingency Drive. Kirill Hale looked at the Authority data chip in Kalen's hand. That chip is the activation key. If you insert that into the primary console on the Old Doubt, it initiates a low-frequency resonance surge through the core. It triggers a controlled, catastrophic core shift, fracturing the planet's mantle and rendering Kepler-18 a chaotic stellar nursery within 48 hours. Kalen felt a nausea unrelated to his burn. Valric hadn't sent him to retrieve a political secret. He had sent him to deploy a weapon of mass extinction. The Authority didn't care about Cyrus's decision. They wanted to wipe out a key strategic point for the enemy. They were using Kalen's desperation as a delivery vector for a planetary annihilation device. The Authority wants the planet fractured, Kalen breathed, the reality sinking in. They're willing to sacrifice the enemy's forward base, the Syndicate, and everyone on it. And you, Kalen, and me, Kirill added. My father never intended for this protocol to be activated. He intended for me to deactivate it when the threat passed. But the Authority found out I was the key to deactivation. They put a price on the data drive, and on my head, to force the activation. Kalen looked at the holographic map. The resonance generator was the Old Doubt's core. His ship was the bomb. The Authority chip was the detonator. The Syndicate, Kalen said, connecting the final piece. They are fighting to keep this protocol from being activated. They know what's coming. The Syndicate is a mercenary group that built its entire infrastructure on the stable, extractable resources of Kepler-18. They learned about the contingency through internal intelligence leaks years ago. They captured me not to exploit me, but to protect themselves. I'm the only person who can access the facility's mainframe and bypass the contingency protocol permanently. The approaching footsteps outside were louder now, closer and heavily muffled. The Syndicate was breaching the service shaft. Kalen had two paths, neither of them survivable in the conventional sense. Dilemma? Option A, escape with Kirill Hale, using her as a hostage against the Authority. This saves his life, clears his debt, and gives him a powerful bargaining chip. But if the Authority cannot activate the contingency, the enemy will secure Kepler-18, using its resources to launch a final, devastating attack on the remaining human systems. Kalen saves himself, condemning the diaspora. Option B. Insert the authority data chip into the old Doubts console, activating the contingency. This guarantees the destruction of the enemy's forward base, but it ensures Kalen and Kirill are atomized in the planetary fracture within 48 hours, clearing his debt only posthumously. Kalen looked at the 72-year-old woman, the living embodiment of Commander Cyrus's guilt and strategic denial. The silent room on the old Doubt hadn't saved context. It had shielded the knowledge of a strategic atrocity. "You're the deactivation key," Kalen said, moving decisively toward the door. "Then we are going back to the ship. We are deactivating the contingency." "That is the correct moral choice, Kalen. But it is the one that guarantees Valrek will find us, capture us, and extract the activation key by force before I can access the old Doubt's central systems." Kalen paused at the blast door, listening to the heavy metal scraping in the shaft above. "Then we give them a distraction," Kalen decided. "We make them think we are activating it. Sever, open a tight channel to the Syndicate's primary command frequency. Transmit a high-priority distress signal claiming we have activated the Cyrus protocol. Lie. Tell them the planetary fracture is commencing in 6 hours. Compliance. Transmitting false activation alert. Expected Syndicate response. Catastrophic panic and immediate attack vector against the old Doubt." "That is the point," Kalen said, pulling Kirill Hale through the blast door. "We need chaos. We need the Syndicate to stop protecting this perimeter and start fighting to save their planet. They won't be looking for 2 people escaping a high-value cell. They'll be looking for a bomb on a rusted cruiser." Kalen shoved Kirill Hale toward the descent shaft, forcing her up the freezing rungs. "Sever, lock the Syndicate transmission to a repeating loop. Contingency protocol initiated. Fracture commencing. Estimated time to planetary instability, 6 hours." As Kalen started his climb, the deep, heavy bass of an emergency klaxon began to blare throughout the Syndicate facility, a sound of profound, localized terror. Above him, the heavy thud of boots turned into frantic, disorganized scrambling. He had just bought their escape, but he had leveraged the extinction of a planet to do it. Kalen reached the top of the shaft. He hauled Kirill Hale out onto the scorching industrial floor. The world outside had changed completely. The floodlights were swinging wildly, tracking the old Doubt. The Syndicate soldiers, abandoning their perimeter defense, were now racing toward the derelict cruiser, not to board, but to attack. Their heavy kinetic rifles were spitting white-hot tracer fire, focused entirely on destroying the single rusted ship. "We run for the perimeter fence, Kirill. They will be focused on the ship," Kalen yelled over the sudden overwhelming noise of war. They ran, hugging the shadows of the massive drilling equipment. Kalen felt the sharp, cold impact of kinetic fire hitting the old Doubt's hull behind them, the sound muffled by the intervening industrial structures, but terrifyingly final. The old Doubt, the Keeper of Silence, was now the focus of a massive, desperate firefight. He reached the fence he had cut moments before. As they slipped through, the Syndicate opened fire with heavier ordnance. Not rifles, but anti-ship missiles. A deafening whump tore the air. Kalen looked back, his heart freezing in his chest. A massive plume of smoke and fire erupted from the old Doubt's center mass. The ancient cruiser had taken a critical hit. Hull integrity failure. Primary fuel cells breached, Sever screamed, the AI's voice cracking with digital panic. "The ship is critical, Kalen, and the contingency drive, the authority chit, was still plugged into the main diagnostic port when we ran." Kalen stared at the burning ship, a cold, sickening dread washing over him. In his haste to create the perfect distraction, he had forgotten the crucial detail. He had left the detonator on the bomb. The Syndicate's missile strike hadn't just damaged the old Doubt, it had activated the contingency. "Sever, status. Activation confirmed. The core resonance generator is online. The authority drive is initiating the final fracture sequence. Estimated time to critical instability?" Sever's voice wavered, then returned with an electronic scream of pure, calculated terror. 5 minutes. Kalen, the planetary fracture is commencing in 5 minutes. The heavy, low-frequency pressure wave from the missile strike pulverized Kalen's hearing, replaced instantly by a high-pitched, insistent ringing that clawed at the inside of his skull. He tasted pulverized rock and copper dust. 5 minutes. He scrambled, dragging Kirill Hale behind him, away from the immediate blast zone. The heat from the burning old Doubt was immediate and brutal, scorching the air and turning the deep red industrial dust to glass. They dove behind a colossal derelict excavation drill head, a hunk of pitted alloy taller than a cargo transport. "The contingency is designed to create a sympathetic fracture with the planetary core's resonant frequency," Kirill said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos. She was breathing shallowly, her composure unnerving. "The detonation was not a conventional explosion." The kinetic impact served as the catalyst, forcing the authority chip's signal directly into the resonance generator. We have triggered an induced seismic collapse. Kalen leaned against the cold metal of the drill bit, fighting a surge of blinding nausea. His burned forearm was screaming, and the sheer weight of the failure pressed down on him, a physical manifestation of industrial fatigue. He had leveraged the end of a planet to escape a 300-cycle debt. 5 minutes? Kalen gasped, spitting out metallic dust. Can we stop the core? No. The energy transfer is asymmetrical and instantaneous. The core is already broadcasting the fracture pulse deep into the mantle. We can't stop the physics, Kalen. We can only slow the consequences. The air above the facility grew thick with the sound of desperate, frantic activity. The Syndicate, the professional exploiters of Kepler-18, were not retreating. They were fighting. Sirens, previously sounding an alarm of mere perimeter breach, now screamed a tone of existential terror. Heavy vehicle engines roared as the Syndicate attempted to evacuate high-value assets, realizing the 6-hour lie Kalen had broadcast was now tragically accelerated truth. Kalen watched the old doubt burn. It was listing heavily, smoke pouring from the hull breaches, obscuring the precise location of the intact core. His ship, his only shield, his ticket home was now a funeral pyre. And it was his fault. He had forgotten the chip. A small physical error committed in a moment of debt-driven panic had resulted in an atrocity of galactic proportions. It was the ultimate bitter joke on human ambition, the bureaucracy of survival, Valrek's debt, leading directly to the destruction of the quiet dignity Cyrus had sought to preserve. My father, Kirill continued, her eyes fixed on the burning wreck, he always maintained that humanity's greatest failures were due to its inability to recognize when to be still. He sought to preserve silence. Instead, he engineered the loudest noise possible. Kalen felt a deep, sickening wave of self-recrimination. He had seen the silence, and he had destroyed it to save himself from a temporary inconvenience. Valrek knew, Kalen muttered, the realization cutting through the pain. He didn't send us here to retrieve data. He sent us to detonate the data. He used my desperation as an expendable delivery vector. The Authority cares nothing for the Syndicate or the resources here. Kepler-18 is a tactical choke point for the enemy forces that pursued us from Proxima, Kirill explained, her technical analysis cold and precise. Destroying the planet prevents the enemy from establishing a permanent deep space base. You were an unwitting weapon, Kalen. You achieved their military objective, clearing your debt in a purely transactional, posthumous way. Kalen squeezed his eyes shut. He had been so focused on the survival of his ledger, the 21,000 cycles of debt, that he had ignored the scale of the moral debt he was accruing. He was disposable, and he had acted precisely according to Valrek's calculation. 1 minute. The ground beneath the drill head began to vibrate with a low, unnatural thrumming. The resonance pulse was intensifying. The air felt heavy, like standing deep underwater. Kalen? Sever's voice, now badly fragmented and strained by the electromagnetic interference, cut through the comms. Seismic activity registered across Kepler-18, magnitude 0.7 and rising. Estimated time to mantle fracture, 3 minutes and 30 seconds. He was left with nothing. No ship, no escape, no debt-clearing objective, and the knowledge that he was personally responsible for ending a world. This was the bottom of the well. Kalen looked at the frantic Syndicate soldiers, racing toward the wreck, their lives reduced to a futile fight against an impossible time limit. Commander Cyrus, Kalen said, his voice raw. He spent 55 years creating the perfect defense for a single room. The vault, the preservation field. It was the only part of the ship that fought back against my attempts to dismantle it. Kirill looked at him, her intense blue eyes searching his face. Yes, the vault was designed to resist entropy. It was not a weapon shield, but a stabilizer. It rejected the chaos of decay. Kalen felt a flicker of icy logic penetrate the fatigue, a desperate, impossible hypothesis based on Cyrus's obsessive vanity. The core is generating resonance, chaos, to fracture the planet, Kalen articulated, focusing past the pain. The vault was designed to generate the opposite, localized, extreme anti-entropy. Sever, did Cyrus leave behind any non-documented system links between the core and the vault environment regulator? Sever processed the question through a wash of static. Affirmative, Kalen. A single highly redundant conduit, labeled Failsafe Alpha. It was designed to prevent the inertial dampener, now the resonance generator, from accidentally destabilizing the vault's preserved atmosphere during heavy maneuvers. The core's power is now maximized and dedicated to planetary resonance, Kalen stated, pushing himself to his feet. The ground was visibly shaking, miniature dust clouds rising and falling. If we can channel that massive resonance power back through the fail-safe alpha conduit, using Kirill's unique neural signature as the key, we don't stop the fracture. We momentarily divert the energy into forcing the anti-entropy field to its absolute maximum. Kirill understood the technical suicide immediately. We would be using a Planet Buster's power to stabilize a library. The overload would vaporize the vault and the conduit, but for a single second, the anti-entropy pulse would be massive. It would create a localized gravimetric bubble. It would buy us an impossible amount of time, or it would simply atomize us, Kalen corrected. But it's the only variable Cyrus left behind that wasn't designed to kill. 2 minutes. The Syndicate soldiers who had reached the old Doubt were no longer firing. They were deploying structural foam, trying futilely to contain the core temperature. They looked like ants pouring water on a bonfire. We need to get to the ship, Kirill. We need to reach the vault access point. The external seam of the vault is still functional, even if the interior is destroyed, Kalen said, grabbing her arm. He started running back toward the burning wreck, moving past the bodies of Syndicate guards who had been crushed by falling debris from the missile hit. The ship was his tomb, and he was running back to it. Kalen used the plasma cutter, now almost out of charge, to cut a shallow trench through the metal plating of a service ramp, creating minimal cover. He glanced at the main control tower. The heavy kinetic battery, sensing the planetary destabilization, was beginning to shift its focus. It was attempting to target the unstable core of the Old Doubt, to ensure immediate, complete destruction, preventing the slow seismic disaster. Sever, how long until the Syndicate battery achieves lock on the core? Estimated 45 seconds, Kalen. They are attempting a high-yield kinetic saturation strike. If they hit the core now, the resulting physical shockwave will accelerate the fracture to immediate 0.0 state. 45 seconds. Kalen reached the hull breach in Sector Gamma 1. Smoke billowed out thick and oily. Go! Kalen shoved Kirill through the jagged tear. He followed, landing in the overheated, darkened corridor. The air inside was choking, the smell of burning plastic and synthetic oil overwhelming. They moved through the ruined, tilted spine of the cruiser, scrambling over debris towards the command deck. Every structural beam Kalen touched was hot to the point of pain. They reached the sealed vault wall. The metal was already discolored by the extreme heat from the burning fuel cells nearby. The access panel, Kirill. The manual override input. Place your hand here, Kalen instructed, pushing her towards the console disguised beneath the defunct diagnostic port. Kirill, silent and focused, pressed her palm against the cooled metal of the input port. A tiny sapphire light, the preserved biometric reader, flickered to life, bathing her face in a momentary ethereal glow. Sever, channel the fail-safe alpha power flow to maximum saturation through this biometric lock. Execute on my mark. Executing a planet's worth of energy through a preservation circuit. Probability of catastrophic local failure, 99.99%. Standby, Sever warned. Outside, Kalen could hear the sharp, mechanical whine of the Syndicate's heavy kinetic battery charging for its final, desperate shot. The sound was deafening, signaling imminent termination. Kalen looked at Kirill, her 72 years of forced isolation culminating in this single, suicidal act of defiance against her father's grand failure. "Mark!" Kalen yelled. A terrifying electrical roar erupted from the metal beneath Kirill's hand. The sapphire light flared, turning white, then blinding emerald green. Kirill cried out as the massive, raw energy of the resonance generator flowed through her touch. The sound was not an explosion, but a violent, tearing vacuum, the sound of all chaos being instantaneously repelled. The ship shuddered, not from impact, but from the immense counterforce. Kalen felt the air pressure in the corridor stabilize violently, dropping the temperature by 60 degrees in a single microsecond. The resonance generator was fighting itself, forced into temporary localized stasis. Failsafe Alpha achieved maximum output, Sever screamed. Gravimetric bubble localized around the core. The Syndicate kinetic battery has locked on. Impact in 3 seconds. The power surged, throwing Kalen backwards into the burning corridor wall. He heard the sound of the anti-entropy field collapsing instantly, overpowered by the brute force of the Planet Buster. But the moment of warp time had passed. Kalen pulled himself up, the floor now trembling violently. The Syndicate kinetic slug hit the Old Doubt with the sound of a universe breaking. The ship did not explode, it dissolved. The force of the impact, channeled directly into the unstable core, did not kill the planet. It stabilized it for a fraction of a second, and then violently ejected the central mass. Kalen felt himself being thrown, weightless, through the air, sucked out through a newly formed void in the hull. He was not burned or crushed, but launched violently into the atmosphere of Kepler-18, spinning uncontrollably, seeing the Syndicate facility shrink beneath him. Then, silence. The overwhelming roar of the planetary disintegration was gone. He tumbled through the red sky, momentarily deafened, and then felt the sudden, shocking pull of an external asymmetrical gravity. He looked down and saw, shrinking rapidly below him, the remaining mass of Kepler-18. The planet was still there. "Kalen! Status?" Sever's voice returned, strained but present. "We are in orbit. You are not dead. I've managed to localize and stabilize the internal processing core into my housing. The planet did not fracture. It initiated a catastrophic core displacement. The energy transfer launched approximately 25 meters of the old Doubt's central spine, and you with it, into a low, chaotic orbit." Kalen's vision cleared. He was free-falling in a zero-gravity void, clad only in a damaged environmental suit. Below him, Kepler-18 was intact, but horribly scarred. A colossal segment of its mantle, a gaping wound kilometers wide, was missing, replaced by a churning, magma-filled vortex. The planet had survived, but at the cost of a massive surgical self-mutilation. Kalen looked across the dark sky. 20 meters away, tumbling end over end, was a chunk of rusted, melted hull plating, the piece containing the vault. And clinging desperately to the ruined metal, illuminated by the distant, dying light of the old Doubt's remains, was Kyril Hale. "Kalen," Sever warned, his voice a low hum of paranoia. "The Syndicate is scrambling intercept vessels. They know we are responsible for the geological trauma. Furthermore, the Authority tracking system, Hound Dog 1, was neutralized. But Valrek is monitoring the localized tactical network. He knows the contingency was activated. He will assume the destruction of the ship was the intended success. He is sending a retrieval team." Kalen checked his suit thrusters. Minimal power remaining. Enough for a single controlled burn towards Kyril. "We are exposed, Sever. We have no ship, no velocity, and we just mutilated a strategic asset. What are our odds?" "Against the Syndicate, 0. Against Valrek's approaching fleet, 0. Against the low-orbit debris field, 0.001%, Sever reported. "However, Kalen, the sudden loss of a massive chunk of the mantle has done something else. The gravity well of Kepler-18 is now acutely unstable. Any warp jump initiated within the next 72 hours will require a catastrophic expenditure of energy, making pursuit almost impossible for conventional vessels." Kalen stabilized his position, using a puff of precious fuel to drift towards Kyril Hale. He was alive, momentarily hidden by the catastrophic failure, and orbiting a dying world with the daughter of the man who had tried to save a library. "We buy time with chaos, Kyril," Kalen muttered to himself, aiming his thrusters. "Valrek wants me dead and silent. The Syndicate wants me dead and crushed. Neither of them want the human diaspora to understand the final failure of Commander Cyrus. And that, Kyril, is now our only remaining leverage." He fired the thrusters, accelerating toward the floating piece of wreckage. The Syndicate intercept vessels were already rising from the wound in the planet, their powerful searchlights sweeping the void. Kalen felt the cold clarity of absolute desperation. He was no hero. He was a survivor, forced to weaponize the truth he had tried to ignore. He reached the wreckage, grabbing Kyril's arm. "We are going to find the remnants of the Proxima campaign," Kalen stated, his voice tight with resolve. "We are going to tell the story of the Hollis Wind contingency, the story of the strategic atrocity, and the systemic failure of the Authority. It will clear the debt, Kyril. It will clear the debt of the whole damned species." Kalen's internal comms suddenly flared with a burst of static, followed by the chillingly calm voice of Valrek himself, patched through a military-grade satellite uplink. "Kalen, you achieved the objective. The contingency is executed. I'm initiating the debt nullification protocol. Prepare for immediate retrieval. However, Kalen, you took an unauthorized asset. Kyril Hale remains Authority property. Do not resist." The low, metallic hum of Valrek's approaching retrieval fleet filled Kalen's helmet. They were close, too close. Kalen held Kyril tight, looking out at the endless black, knowing that the greatest battle was not against alien forces or planetary annihilation, but against the relentless, cold calculus of human control. He had to run, and the galaxy was listening. "Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country, or planet, are you watching from right now?" "The commander is tracking every active signal." Kalen felt the surge of Valrek's voice in his comms. Not a threat, but a statement of institutional fact. "You achieved the objective." The debt was nullified by the destruction of a planetary asset, according to the Authority's ruthless calculation. Valrek had won the strategic exchange, but Kalen refused the political capitulation. "Sever, scramble the frequency. Cross-channel feedback into the Authority uplink," Kalen ordered, his voice strained by the exertion of pulling Kyril against the tumbling wreckage. "Scrambling initiated," Sever replied. "Valrek's comms are attempting to override the suit's internal processors. High-level encryption attack detected. If penetration is successful, the suit's life support will be remotely terminated. 3 seconds to probable lock." Kalen ignored the countdown. He looked at Kirill, her face pale, the sapphire-green glow from the defunct biometric port still clinging faintly to her skin. The energy transfer had nearly consumed her, but it had stabilized the physics long enough. "You are not Authority property." "Kirill," Kalen insisted, his voice echoing in his helmet. He was trying to instill conviction where logic provided none. "You are the living proof of their final failure." He knew the Authority's protocol. Valrek would not risk a public engagement with the Syndicate. He would attempt a clean, surgical snatch and grab using advanced stealth vessels. The Authority's retrieval teams were notoriously efficient and completely silent. Kalen needed noise. He needed a distraction large enough to deter the calculated efficiency of the Authority. "Sever, locate the nearest intact kinetic battery from the Syndicate facility below. Target the biggest signature in Valrek's approaching fleet." Kalen, we have no targeting solution. Our energy reserves are dedicated to maintaining the minimum life support and counter-encryption, Sever argued. And even if we did, we cannot transmit a fire order to a Syndicate asset. We are in hostile territory. "We don't need to transmit a fire order," Kalen corrected, his eyes fixed on the receding, jagged wound of Kepler-18. Below them, the Syndicate facility was burning, but their defensive infrastructure, built on layers of redundant systems, was still active. "We need to transmit Valrek's encrypted retrieval code to the Syndicate's main defense matrix. Flood their network with high-level Authority command traffic." Kirill understood immediately. "Now you want to make the Syndicate think the Authority is initiating a full-scale tactical invasion to steal their remaining assets. You are weaponizing paranoia." "Precisely," Kalen confirmed. "Valrek's silent retrieval team is the biggest threat. If the Syndicate believes they are under attack by the Authority, they will fight the only battle they know, the economic one. They will defend their scrap, their resources, and their corporate pride with every ounce of firepower they have left." "Execution initiated," Sever confirmed, a sudden surge of Aptaos paranoia electrica sparking across Kalen's internal display. Using a 5-second pulse of residual anti-entropy field energy to mask the code injection, high-level Authority command sequences are now saturating the Syndicate network. The effect was instantaneous and brutal. Below, the Syndicate's remaining kinetic batteries, previously focused on containing the planetary trauma, abruptly turned. Their primary focus shifted from geological disaster management to deep space tactical defense. The Syndicate was not philosophical. It was predatory. An Authority encroachment was a declaration of financial war. 3 heavy-pulse kinetic rounds, each the size of a small freighter, ripped through the void, aimed not at Kalen, but at the vector of Valrek's approaching fleet. The Authority fleet, which had been approaching with the clinical stealth of a precision surgical unit, was forced into emergency evasive maneuvers. Valrek's tactical signature, previously silent, screamed with electronic outrage and confusion. "The Syndicate has retaliated," Sever announced, a note of grim satisfaction in his digitized voice. "Valrek's retrieval plan is compromised. He is forced to engage the Syndicate forces or retreat. His window for clean acquisition is closed." Kalen gripped the remnants of the old Doubt's hull plating. He and Kirill were riding a small, self-propelled piece of wreckage, orbiting a planet that was fighting for its life, caught between 2 colossal, warring bureaucracies. He had just successfully instigated a conflict between the Galactic Corporate Syndicate and the Human Authority, using obsolete human technology and an injection of pure, unfiltered political fear. But the plan had a critical flaw. The energy required to mask the code injection had exhausted the minimal power reserves Kalen had maintained for his own thrusters. They were now drifting. "Fuel status, 0, Sever stated. "We are entirely subject to the chaotic, asymmetrical gravity of Kepler-18's mutilated core. We will be pulled into the atmosphere within 90 minutes. Kalen looked at the small piece of hull he was gripping, 20 meters long, 5 meters wide, melted and scorched, and at its center, the polymer steel plating of the sealed vault, utterly untouched. "Kirill, we need to get inside the vault section," Kalen said, his voice barely a whisper against the constant static. "The vault is a preservation chamber, not a lifeboat," Kirill pointed out, shivering despite the residual warmth of the suit. "It is the only section of the ship designed to reject entropy," Kalen corrected. "It's structurally sound, shielded by layers of material designed to resist centuries of decay. If we can open it, we have an insulated shell. We can survive the atmospheric re-entry if we have to." Kalen pulled himself across the jagged metal towards the sealed seam. The biometric lock, which Kirill had activated minutes ago with the power of a world-shattering resonance, was now dark, dead. "Sever, manual override for the vault door," Kalen commanded. "Negative, Kalen. The internal mechanisms were overloaded by the fail-safe alpha surge. They are fused. The polymer steel seam is locked permanently." Kalen leaned his weight against the cold, smooth metal. The irony was suffocating. He had destroyed the ship, mutilated a world, and instigated a galactic conflict, all to survive a debt. Now, his only salvation was locked behind the very silence he had sought to preserve. "There must be a backup," Kalen insisted, running his hand along the seam, searching for the telltale sign of a maintenance hatch or a forgotten service port. Cyrus built this ship to preserve the integrity of that room, even through planetary maneuvers and catastrophic decompression. He would have designed an absolute final override. Commander Cyrus was notoriously paranoid about unauthorized access, Sever reported. His final override system was mechanical and completely isolated from the ship's primary electrical grid. It required a unique manual input sequence performed directly upon the locking mechanisms, a maintenance technician's secret. Kalen paused. He remembered the old human military tech manuals, dense, rambling documents that prioritized redundancy and complex physical maneuvers over simple electronic fixes. The core of human engineering was always a messy, mechanical retreat from elegance. "Plumbers, Sever. They always relied on the plumbers," Kalen muttered. "Where's the manual release for the locking solenoid?" Sever accessed the archival schematics he had retrieved from the optical drive in the vault before its temporary activation. Locating. The primary solenoid requires a 90-degree turn, followed by 2 clockwise rotations and 1 counterclockwise rotation of the emergency vacuum release valve, which must be performed simultaneously with the manual application of 100 pounds of counterpressure on the external frame. Kalen felt a bitter laugh escape his chest. It was absurdly human, a complex, physics-defying maintenance trick designed to prevent anyone without 20 years of field experience from opening the door accidentally. "Kirill, you need to apply the counterpressure," Kalen said, pointing to a small structural rib near the seam. "You need to hold it there. 100 pounds, sustained." Kirill nodded, her eyes fierce. She used the magnetized soles of her boots to anchor herself to the tumbling metal, positioning her back against the rib. She braced her hands and pushed, concentrating her weight into a focused point of pressure. Kalen found the small, almost invisible vacuum release valve, a tiny brass knob recessed deep within the oxidized surface. He wrapped his gloved hand around it. This was not a fight against lasers or kinetic slugs. It was a fight against rust, gravity, and bureaucratic redundancy. He turned the knob 90 degrees, the old mechanism grinding against years of fused metal. He felt the counterpressure from Kirill increase, her low grunt filtering through the comms. 2 rotations clockwise, 1 counterclockwise. With a final terrible screech of protest, the deep, heavy polymer steel seam opened, retracting inwards with astonishing speed, exposing the small, silent library within. Kalen shoved Kirill inside the gaping hole. "Sever, seal the door manually." The second Kalen climbed through, pulling the thick metal plate back into place. The impact hit. It was not an explosion, but a sudden, violent shudder. The piece of wreckage they were clinging to had been clipped by a piece of high-velocity debris, a consequence of the Syndicate and Authority exchange. The entire segment of the vault section began to tumble with increased, sickening velocity. Kalen quickly inspected the interior. The books were scattered, the leather chair overturned. The core chronometer, the clock-like device, was smashed, its crystal face shattered. But they were alive and enclosed. The ambient temperature stabilized instantly. "Internal analysis complete," Sever stated, his voice now crisp and clear, insulated by the vault structure. "The structural integrity is maintained. The vault environment is protecting us from the shock of re-entry. However, our trajectory is accelerating towards the planetary surface. We are descending into the magnetic interference field of Kepler-18. Kalen secured his harness to a preserved reading desk. He looked at Kirill, who was staring at the shattered chronometer. "The clock is broken," Kalen observed. "The countdown is over." "The countdown to the field collapse?" Kirill confirmed, her voice empty. "The 58 units of preserved silence. We used up the commander's final resource to save our lives." Kalen braced himself as the descent accelerated, the hull screaming against the friction of the atmosphere. The anti-entropy field, even in death, was fighting the decay, protecting them from the flames that licked the external structure. "Valric's forces cannot follow us into the atmosphere for 72 hours. Due to the destabilized gravity, well," Kalen reminded her, clutching the desk, "the Syndicate has retreated to defensive positions. We have bought time." The silence inside the vault was complete, broken only by the shriek of atmospheric friction outside. They were hurtling toward an unknown landing zone on a mutilated world. As they dropped, the atmosphere began to clear, replaced by the dense, electromagnetic noise of Kepler-18's deep crust. Kalen looked out through the small, reinforced observation port. Below them, the planet was a nightmare of red and black. The giant, open wound in the mantle, glowed with liquid fire. But further out, in the shadow line of the twilight, Kalen saw the wreckage of a massive defensive ring long abandoned orbiting the planet. structures of incredible forgotten complexity, covered in generations of orbital dust. "The Proxima campaign," Kalen whispered, recognizing the signature silhouette of human heavy defense platforms. "We have entered the Sector 13 dead zone," Sever confirmed, his voice vibrating with fadiga industrial errors. As the stress mounted, "The defense network is partially active. Warning, we are about to impact the surface. Prepare for catastrophic deceleration." Kalen closed his eyes, accepting the inevitable shock. He had survived the Authority, the Syndicate, and a planetary core detonation. He was entering the very heart of the conflict he had been trying to understand. The crash was not a single violent impact, but a prolonged, tearing smash through the crust of Kepler-18. The vault, reinforced by the anti-entropy field's final gasp, held. The world outside went silent again, only this time it was not the silence of space, but the muffled stillness of complete structural burial. Kalen opened his eyes. He was lying in the debris, untouched, the small library now a cave of safety buried deep within the red dust. He heard Kirill stirring beside him. "Status," Kalen commanded, forcing the oxygen into his lungs. "We are stationary, buried approximately 20 meters beneath the surface," Sever reported. "The hull is compromised, but the vault structure is intact. External atmosphere is breathable, but highly corrosive. We have limited power, limited communication, and the entire military-grade wreckage of the Proxima campaign is orbiting directly above us." Kalen activated his suit lights. The small room was dark, except for the tiny, flickering red light of Sever. He looked at the overturned leather chair, the scattered, priceless books. "We have the time, Kirill," Kalen said, his voice raw with exhaustion. "Valrek is stalled. The Syndicate is preoccupied. We are in the one place they fear to tread, the silent ruins of humanity's greatest mistake." He detached his safety harness, crawling across the pulverized wood floor. He looked at the ruined desk where Commander Cyrus had written his final log. Kalen felt the cold, gritty dust of Kepler-18 pressing down on the polymer steel shell. The Authority wanted the political context, the data that proved humanity sold its future for temporary survival, Kalen mused, his voice flat. But Cyrus left behind something better than a historical record. He left behind a place to think. Now we use that silence to understand the total cost of their decision. Kalen reached the wall and started looking for the emergency excavation tools. The Authority was trapped outside the gravity well. The Syndicate was fighting ghosts. But above them, the silent fleet of the Proxima campaign lay waiting, filled with secrets and lethal, forgotten weapons. The debt was nullified. But the war had just become personal, confined to the ruins of a species that had always managed to survive, not by its strength, but by its sheer, relentless capacity for error. Kalen had become a weapon of pure context, hiding inside a monument to quiet failure, waiting for the galaxy to catch up to the truth. The metallic screech of deceleration had been replaced by a deep, absolute stillness. The gravity of Kepler-18's fractured core settled around the vault section like cooling magma. 20 meters above them, the pulverized regolith filtered out the magnetic crackle of the atmosphere, leaving only the sound of Kalen's own labored breathing in the quiet. Intermittent hiss of Kirill's life support recycling unit. Kalen pulled himself upright, bracing against the overturned reading desk. His body ached, a deep, muscular throb that spoke not of one battle, but of weeks of relentless, cumulative strain. This was the decadencia biologica of protracted conflict, the body finally demanding payment for borrowed adrenaline. "Sever, report structural integrity and air quality within the vault," Kalen ordered, his voice flat. "The vault maintains 100% integrity. We are an insulated cavity within the wreckage mass. External atmosphere is corrosive, but not breaching. Oxygen levels nominal. Power reserves critical, 0.04%. We have enough energy to sustain minimal life support for both suits for approximately 3 cycles." Kalen looked around the small space. The preservation chamber, designed by Commander Cyrus to be a sanctuary for philosophy, was now a dusty, buried bunker. The leather chair was still overturned, and the scattered books lay like silent casualties of the crash. "We are alive," Kalen stated, testing the weight of the words. They sounded inadequate, sterile. Kirill slowly pushed herself away from the wall. The sapphire glow on her pale face was gone, replaced by the gray fatigue of exposure and exhaustion. "Valrek will know we survived the atmosphere," Kirill said, her voice thin. "The orbital debris field is still locked. The Syndicate engagement will only delay him. He has 72 hours of free rein to devise a retrieval strategy." 72 hours is 72 lifetimes in this business," Kalen countered. He moved toward the vault door, the heavy polymer steel seam that had required the mechanical complexity of a 100-pound counterpressure to open. It was now sealed by tons of planetary dust. "We used the anti-entropy field's last reserve to protect us from re-entry. We are locked in." The irony was not lost on him. The preservation field, the very technology Commander Cyrus had meticulously guarded against decay and salvage, had finally fulfilled its purpose by sealing them inside its monument to failure. "The debt is cleared, Kalen," Kyril observed, watching him futilely push against the massive door. "You achieved the authorities' required asset destruction. Valric cannot claim your identity sequence now." Kalen stopped, leaning his forehead against the cold metal. "The ledger is balanced by the complete loss of all other assets, including the cruiser, the escape vector, and any realistic future solvency. Valric exchanged a 20,000 cycle debt for a lifetime of incarceration on a death world. He won the political exchange." He kicked a piece of metal, a shard of the ruined chronometer. It was still marked by the same familiar scent he had encountered back on Relithport, months or maybe years ago, the odor of burnt lubricant and old static dust. The Fadiga Industrial. Of a civilization collapsing, now suffocatingly intimate. "We bought time, not freedom," Kalen concluded. He crouched, running his hand over the pulverized surface of the floor, feeling the grit of the red soil infiltrating his gloves. He began sorting the scattered texts, driven by a deep, restless need for order in the chaos. The mission, then, is not to escape, but to understand what Cyrus hid here, Kalen decided, his tone shifting back to the disciplined register of a strategist. Valric sought the Hollis Wind contingency, the political record of the retreat. Cyrus sealed the ship to prevent the retrieval of context. Kyril nodded, picking up a heavy leather-bound book. The commander understood that records are weapons, and that truth is always secondary to survival. "We have the time, and we have the location," Kalen confirmed. "We are within the Proxima campaign perimeter. The Authority will not risk their fleet here. The Syndicate considers this territory economically worthless. We are temporarily exempt from galactic capitalism." He looked at Kyril, recognizing the profound isolation they now shared, an isolation born of being utterly divorced from the systems that governed civilized space. "We need to find a way out of this vault, but we cannot rely on electrical power. We need to find the commander's secret access points. The redundant systems," Kalen mused, his mind already calculating mechanical stress points. "The human obsession with mechanical backup over elegant design." "And what happens when we open the vault, Kalen?" Kyril asked, her voice low. "We emerge onto a broken world, directly under the silent guns of the Proxima defense ring. We will be criminals with nowhere to go, carrying the secret of humanity's total surrender." Kalen looked at the sealed door again. He remembered standing outside the hull of the old Doubt on Relithport, cutting through the heavy plating, convinced he could salvage profit from philosophical failure. Now he was inside the failure, and the profit was irrelevant. "We find the secret, Kyril," Kalen said, lifting the heavy excavation tool, a crude manual device devoid of advanced electronics. "We find the archives, and we use that context to ensure neither the Authority nor the Syndicate can weaponize the knowledge of human weakness against the survivors." He began chipping at the polymer steel seam, not in a frantic attempt to escape, but with the steady, measured rhythm of long-term labor. Each blow echoed in the silent vault, a stubborn protest against the forces of entropy and debt. He was a survivor now, a refugee hiding in the historical record of a colossal retreat. He was buried in the remains of the Old Doubt, the cruiser he had bought for 300 cycles, the ship whose salvaged core had refused to be touched. Now, the debt was paid, the core was destroyed, and Kalen was left only with the dust and the crushing metallic weight of systemic human failure. The sound of the chipping tool was the only disruption to the isolamento, a tiny, persistent noise against the vast indifference of the buried world. The coolant line exploded with a sound like tearing fabric, showering Kalen's environmental suit in superheated vaporized flux. He recoiled instantly, the pain registering as a sharp, localized burn on his left shoulder insulation, though the suit maintained integrity. "Density shift registered," Sever reported, the AI's voice tight with electronic aggravation. "Structural integrity in Sector Beta 7 now reads at 0.03%. Kalen, the hull is not separating, it is liquefying." Kalen pulled the cutting laser back, the exposed wiring beneath the heavy plating of the Old Doubt sparking with terminal inefficiency. The odor of burnt lubricant and old static dust, the hallmark of high-grade human military failure, choked the interior atmosphere. "Human failures always complicate thermodynamics, Sever. Pull us back." The inertial dampener core. The reason Kalen had spent 3 agonizing cycles cutting through this section was inaccessible. It was not merely fused to the hull. It was physically integrated, stabilized by a localized field of unknown persistent energy. The core was untouchable, preserved with the same baffling perfection as the sealed reading room he had found and chosen to hide. "The commander won." Kalen thought bitterly, wiping sweat that condensed inside his helmet. The cruiser refuses to be salvaged. This was not merely a mechanical setback. It was a financial death blow. Kalen had gambled the last of his working credit on the 300 cycles needed to acquire the cruiser, betting that the high-value military components would clear his 6-week debt to the Relith Port Authority. Time elapsed since contract initiation. 24 hours, 0 minutes, Sever informed him, stating the obvious cruelty of the deadline. We have recovered precisely 0% of the estimated 20,000 cycles required to clear your debt obligation. Kalen looked at the glowing red barrier protecting the dampener core. It shimmered, humming a low frequency that made the fillings in his teeth ache. This was not benign preservation. It was aggressive defense of obsolete technology. They didn't just abandon their ships, Kalen muttered, kicking a heavy piece of insulation. It clattered down the corroded corridor. They booby-trapped them with philosophy. He cycled the airlock open. The wind shear of Relith Port hit him, a chaotic gale carrying the sharp tang of ionized copper and the deep fatigue industrial. He climbed down the scaffolding, the platform shaking beneath his weight. Waiting for him on the rusted perimeter, bathed in the sickly yellow-orange light of the docking bay, was Valrek. Valrek was a Catharian, a species that had evolved patience and predatory efficiency in equal measure. His scales were the color of tarnished brass, and his eyes, multifaceted black lenses, showed no reflection, only calculation. He was flanked by 2 Authority enforcers, their heavy pulse rifles hanging ready. Kalen, Valrek hissed, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like sandpaper on steel. You missed the deadline by 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Kalen removed his helmet, the cold air hitting his face. He felt the tension constrict his throat, making speech difficult. Valrek, the dampeners are fused. I require 48 more hours to bypass the core locks. This is military hardware, not scrap plating. Valrek tilted his head, a gesture of mild professional amusement. You purchased a scrap husk, Kalen. That was your assessment. The Authority accepts scrap value only. Your purchase price was 300 cycles. Your accrued debt is 21,500 cycles. The interest is astronomical, Kalen argued, fighting to keep his voice level. It is market standard for salvaged human relic liabilities, Valrek countered smoothly. And now, since you have failed to render payment, the debt is accelerated. The ship is forfeit. You are forfeit. Kalen felt the cold dread sink into his bones. Being forfeit on Relith Port meant slow disassembly for parts, or worse, forced conscription into the deep space extraction contracts, which were 99% fatal. I have assets, Valrek. I have contacts. I can move 3,000 tons of polymer steel alloy in 60 hours if you grant me access to the deep-cut machinery. Valrek smiled, a slow, unpleasant parting of his jaws that revealed 3 rows of serrated teeth. The Authority already owns the hull, Kalen. We own the dirt you stand on, and soon we will own the suit you wear. However, the Catharian paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle, savoring the taste of Kalen's sudden, visceral fear. This was the injustice, the efficient, systemic crushing of a minor failure using debt as the primary weapon. The Authority has an opportunity for you, a contract, one mission. If you complete it, the debt is cleared. If you fail, the assets are recovered from your biological envelope. Kalen did not ask the rate of recovery. He already knew it would be cold, clinical, and complete. What is the mission? Kalen asked, tasting the Decadencia Biologica. The faint, moldy smell of the port's recycled air mixed with the adrenaline surging through his system. Valrek's enforcers moved slightly, tightening their perimeter. The air vibrated with the low, menacing hum of their pulse weapons. The Authority requires the retrieval of a specific piece of human technology, Valrek stated, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. It is designated the Hollis Wynn Contingency. It is an archival drive, located deep within the ruins of the Proxima Campaign perimeter. Kalen stiffened. The Proxima Campaign. That meant the Sector 13 dead zone, where the heavy gravity wells made warp jumps suicidal and the orbital debris field was still active with automated 50-year-old human defense platforms. That area is off limits. Autonomous weapon systems fire on anything with a thermal signature greater than 0.7 Kelvin. It's a tomb world, Kalen said, the words catching in his throat. Precisely. That is why the mission is worth 25,000 cycles and the nullification of your debt. The data we seek is non-military, non-commercial. It is political in nature. It concerns the command structure's decision regarding the final evacuation vector. The decision to run, Kalen thought. The final disastrous retreat. Why an archival drive? Why not simply hack the military nets? The drive is believed to contain the unedited raw log of the final Command Council meeting, We need the original context, Kalen. We want to understand the moment when humanity, faced with true existential threat, decided to cannibalize itself to survive. This is information the current human diaspora refuses to release. Valric held out a small, metallic datachit. The coordinates are locked to this device. You will use the Old Doubt as your transport. The cruiser, for all its rusted vanity, is shielded by its very obsolescence. Its spectral signature will be recognized as harmless debris by the ancient defense network. Kalen looked down at the chip. Using the very symbol of human failure, the ship that held the core of their regret, to retrieve the official record of their final, desperate political failure. It was perfectly, cruelly ironic. You have 72 hours, Kalen. Failure means the authority initiates immediate claim on all your current and future assets, including your identity sequence. Kalen took the chip, feeling the faint charge of paranoia electrica running through the metal. It was cold, small, and utterly damning. He looked back at the rusted hulk of the Old Doubt, now his only lifeline. Inside that ship, behind a meter of polymer steel, was a library dedicated to saving silence and contemplation. Outside, he was being forced into a suicide run to expose the loudest, most frantic moment of human history. Understood, Kalen said, the word a rasp of resignation. I will prepare the Old Doubt for jump. Valric gave a curt nod, turning away with his enforcers. As they moved, the ambient lighting caught the multifaceted surface of the Catharian's eye, and Kalen saw the deep, chilling lack of emotion. He was just a ledger, balanced by the expenditure of a disposable life. Kalen returned to the airlock, the heavy metallic smell of the port settling deep in his lungs. He needed to calculate the fuel. He needed to calibrate the jump drive. And most pressingly, he needed to bypass the Old Doubt's impossible preservation field, not for profit, but for survival. If the ship was going into the Proxima Dead Zone, it needed every ounce of power, even if it meant destroying the Commander Cyrus's silent monument. He reached the airlock manual override. Sever reappeared beside his shoulder, the cubic drone analyzing the data chip. The coordinates are precise, Kalen. The depth of the debris field is extreme. Survival probability, accounting for ship decay and the hostile environment, is estimated at 0.002%. This is not a contract. It is an execution order disguised as a debt restructuring initiative. I know, Sever, Kalen whispered, his hand resting on the corroded metal door. Furthermore, Sever continued, the synthesized voice now unusually clipped, the data chip contains a secondary file. It is encrypted, military grade, and locked to the presence of a specific neural signature, that of Commander Cyrus, the man who sailed this ship to oblivion. Kalen stopped. He stared at the rusted airlock. He is the key to accessing the Hollis Win contingency, Sever concluded. Valric knows Cyrus is dead. Unless Cyrus did not complete his mission of isolation, he left behind something else. Kalen looked back at the sealed wall containing the silent room. He had assumed the commander had died peacefully, alone, guarding his books. Now Kalen knew he had to open that vault again. He needed to know what part of Commander Cyrus might still be listening, and what terrible tool he had left for the next man to discover. The silence of the tomb world was about to be broken. The only thing left to salvage was the silence, and that silence was now their prison. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.